When people had no money but still needed to eat, they made meals with whatever they could find. These dishes weren't fancy, but they helped people stay alive. Here's how some smart cooking kept everyone going during hard times. Let's start with Hoover Stew. The smell of Hoover Stew would fill tiny apartments across America in the 1930s. Named after the president many blamed for the economic disaster, this meal kept families fed during the hardest times. Naming your sad dinner after the president was like having nothing in your wallet and still finding a way to leave a tip. The recipe was simple: macaroni, chopped hot dogs, canned tomatoes, and maybe some corn if luck was on your side. One pot could feed an entire family, and leftovers could be watered down for the next day. The flavor was so bland that taste buds would fall asleep halfway through dinner, but nobody complained because complaining burns calories and nobody could afford to waste those. When even canned tomatoes became too expensive, many families turned to something even simpler. Canned milk gravy poured over stale bread became a dinner staple when bank accounts ran dry. Why waste time building up to it? Times were hard, and this meal was harder. A spoonful of flour browned in a pan with butter, if any could be found, then mixed with canned evaporated milk until thick. Pour it over bread that was too stale to eat on its own, and suddenly you had a meal that filled the stomach, if not the soul. The gravy was so thin, you had to eat fast before your dinner soaked through the table. Between 1929 and 1933, sales of canned milk doubled across America. With fresh milk spoiling quickly and ice boxes being luxuries many couldn't afford, those little tin cans became kitchen gold. One can of evaporated milk could be stretched with water to make enough gravy for 6 people if you knew how to make it right. The trick was in the stirring, constant motion to keep lumps from forming. Children would take turns with the wooden spoon, their arms getting tired as they watched the pale mixture slowly thicken. If you stopped stirring too soon, your gravy had more bumps than the roads between farming towns. Some families added pepper or a pinch of salt if they had it. Fancy households might toss in a tablespoon of dried onion. The bread underneath hardly mattered. It was just something to hold the gravy and give teeth something to do. When bread became scarce, many families turned instead to another cheap staple that grew plentiful in their own backyards. Cornbread with raw onion slices became a popular duo in Southern households during hard times. This simple meal filled countless bellies when grocery shelves were as empty as wallets. Across the dusty South, cornmeal was a blessing. Cheap, easy to store, and filling. Unlike wheat flour that needed yeast to rise, cornbread just needed water, salt, and fire. A single 5-pound sack could feed a family for nearly 2 weeks if stretched carefully. During the 1930s, cornmeal consumption rose by 40% as families looked for affordable ways to stay fed. Many homes had cast iron skillets passed down through generations, making cornbread possible even when the electricity got cut off. The skillet went straight over wood coals, and 20 minutes later, dinner was served. The cornbread was often so dense that dropping a piece could be considered a foundation for your next home. Raw onion rings served alongside provided both flavor and nutrition when meat was just a memory. Onions grew easily in backyard gardens and stored well through winter. The sharp bite of the onion made the plain cornbread taste like something worth eating. The combination was so pungent that after dinner, nobody would stand close enough to ask you for a loan. The meal became a symbol of making do with what you had. Families would gather around the table, breaking golden squares of cornbread and layering them with onion slices, a reminder that simple food could still bring people together. When even these simple ingredients became hard to find, families had to get creative with whatever vegetables they could grow or forage from their surroundings. When you've got potatoes, you've got hope. This saying rang true in many households during the Great Depression as potato pancakes became a go-to meal for struggling families. Did you know that during the 1930s, the average American ate almost 200 pounds of potatoes per year? These humble tubers were cheap, filling, and could be stored for months in cool, dark places. For many families, a 50-pound sack of potatoes meant survival through winter. Making potato pancakes required minimal ingredients: grated potatoes, a bit of flour, salt, and maybe an egg if chickens were part of the backyard menagerie. The mixture was flattened and fried in whatever fat was available, often bacon grease saved from Sunday breakfast or lard rendered down from rare meat scraps. These pancakes were so different from what we call pancakes today, that they should have asked for a different name. They were more like sad hash browns trying to look fancy for a job interview. The crispy outside and soft inside made potato pancakes feel like a treat even in the darkest times. Families would gather around as Mom grated potatoes by hand on metal graters, knuckles often becoming part of the recipe. By the end of the Depression, most mothers had fingerprints that were completely different from when they started. Children waited impatiently as the pancakes sizzled in the pan, the smell promising something more exciting than just another potato dish. These pancakes were considered fancy dining, the Depression-era equivalent of eating at a five-star restaurant, except the 5 stars were actually just grease stains on the ceiling. For many immigrants, potato pancakes connected them to old country recipes, latkes, plaki, or boxties, depending on where your grandparents came from. While potatoes kept many families fed, sometimes people had to look beyond the garden and into their yards for the next meal. If it grew in the yard and didn't bite back, it went in the bowl. Dandelion salad became a common meal during the Great Depression when grocery money vanished, but weeds kept growing strong. Fields and yards across America suddenly transformed into free grocery stores as families learned which plants were safe to eat. Dandelion greens topped the list of wild edibles. They grew everywhere, came back after being picked, and contained more nutrition than many store-bought vegetables. 1 cup of dandelion greens contains more calcium than a glass of milk and more iron than spinach. Gathering dandelions became a family activity. Children would fan out across neighborhoods, paper bags in hand, collecting the youngest, tenderest leaves before the plants could flower. The kids who once pulled weeds as punishment now pulled them for dinner. Talk about a promotion with terrible benefits. Preparing dandelion salad was simple. Wash the greens thoroughly and hope no dog had marked that patch as territory, then soak them in salt water to remove some bitterness. A splash of vinegar and maybe a sprinkle of sugar were all that most families could afford for dressing. The taste was so sharp it could wake up taste buds that had been napping since Tuesday. Many immigrant families already knew about eating dandelions from old country traditions, where wild greens had been eaten for generations. Italian and Eastern European communities particularly embraced these yard-to-table meals. The dandelion, once a hated lawn invader, became a symbol of survival and resourcefulness. Gardens might fail and stores might close, but these hardy plants kept growing. When families craved something sweet after their foraged meals, they often turned to yesterday's stale bread for an unexpected dessert solution. Old bread never went to waste. It became dessert somehow. Bread pudding emerged as a Depression-era favorite by transforming stale leftovers into a sweet treat that could make everyone forget about empty pockets for a few minutes. During the 1930s, an average family of 4 would use a loaf of bread every day, which cost around 6 cents. Even at that price, allowing bread to spoil was unthinkable. As the saying went, waste not, want not. This mindset turned bread pudding from an old recipe into a survival strategy. To make bread pudding, families would tear stale bread into chunks and soak them in a mixture of milk, sugar, and eggs, if they were fortunate enough to have these ingredients. Often, eggs would be reduced or eliminated entirely, with a bit more milk used to compensate. The mixture was then baked until it formed a soft custard around the now softened bread. Some bread puddings were so dense they could double as building materials. You knew times were tough when your dessert could patch a hole in your roof. The magic of bread pudding was its versatility. It could be flavored with whatever was available. A sprinkle of cinnamon, dried fruit saved from better days, or even a splash of vanilla if the family had been saving it for special occasions. The finished dish could be served warm for dinner or cold the next morning for breakfast. It was almost impossible to mess up bread pudding, which was fortunate since culinary school wasn't high on the priority list when 1 in 4 Americans couldn't find work. When bread wasn't available, creative cooks turned to another surprising dessert substitution. How do you make apple pie without apples? Easy. Crackers and imagination. During the Great Depression, mock apple pie fooled taste buds across America when real fruit became an unaffordable luxury. The secret ingredient? Ritz crackers. Introduced in 1934 for 29 cents a box, these round crackers quickly became the star of a remarkable culinary magic trick. When soaked in a mixture of water, sugar, cream of tartar, and lemon juice, then baked in a pie crust, the crackers transformed into something that tasted surprisingly like apple filling. The chemical reaction between the tartness of the lemon, the sweetness of the sugar, and the texture of the softened crackers created an illusion so convincing that many dinner guests never suspected they were eating crackers instead of fruit. A dash of cinnamon and nutmeg completed the deception. At a time when fresh apples could cost precious pennies that families couldn't spare, this recipe spread across neighborhood fences and appeared in community cookbooks throughout the country. Nabisco, the maker of Ritz crackers, began printing the recipe directly on their boxes in 1935, where it remained for decades. The pie was such a convincing fake that it could have had a successful career in Hollywood impersonating the real thing. For holiday meals, when families wanted to serve something special, despite empty pockets, mock apple pie offered dignity and normalcy. Children whose families regularly served this substitute sometimes grew up not realizing apple pie was supposed to contain actual apples. The most valuable skill during the Depression wasn't cooking. It was convincing yourself that crackers were apples and that tomorrow might be better. When the budget couldn't stretch for even a box of crackers, desperate cooks turned to even stranger food combinations that might make modern stomachs turn. Desperation is a great spice. Peanut butter stuffed onions might sound like a dare rather than dinner, but during the Great Depression, this odd combination actually made its way onto many tables across America. Large sweet onions became edible bowls when their centers were scooped out and filled with a glob of peanut butter. The logic was simple. Onions were cheap and easy to grow, while peanut butter provided much-needed protein when meat was unaffordable. Together, they created a meal that kept hunger away, even if it did the same to friends with its powerful breath aftermath. Between 1929 and 1935, peanut butter consumption increased by 35% nationwide. Its long shelf life and relatively low cost made it a Depression-era staple. A single jar could last a family for weeks when used sparingly, providing essential protein and fats that were otherwise hard to come by. The first person to stuff an onion with peanut butter probably wasn't aiming for a culinary award, just trying to get through the day without their stomach performing a solo concert. The dish was typically served raw, though some families would bake the stuffed onions if they could afford to run the oven. The heat mellowed the onion's sharp flavor while warming the peanut butter to a creamy consistency. A splash of vinegar or a sprinkle of salt might be added for extra flavor. Your breath after eating this concoction could clear a crowded room faster than an announcement about mandatory donations. As families struggled with ever stricter budgets, some households turned to an even simpler vegetable option that required almost no preparation at all. They say cabbage has layers. During the Depression, it had roles, main course, side dish, and often regret. When food was scarce, a head of boiled cabbage could become an entire meal for a hungry family with little else to eat. Cabbage earned its place on Depression-era tables for 3 simple reasons. It was dirt cheap, incredibly filling, and stayed good for months in cool storage. A single 5-cent head could feed a family of 6 and still leave leftovers for the next day. In some rural areas, cabbage consumption doubled between 1929 and 1933. The cooking method couldn't be simpler. Just drop the quartered head into boiling water and wait until soft. No butter, no salt, no flavor besides what nature intended cabbage to taste like. Many families would keep a pot of cabbage water simmering all week, adding new chunks as needed and drinking the broth for extra nutrition. The vitamins that leached out into the water were often more valuable than what remained in the vegetable itself. The smell of boiling cabbage became the unofficial perfume of poor neighborhoods, a scent so strong it could make wallpaper peel in surrender. The truly resourceful would save cabbage cores and outer leaves for soups or chop and ferment them into sauerkraut for winter storage. Nothing went to waste. By the third day of cabbage meals, most families agreed that the vegetable's greatest nutritional value was teaching patience. Those looking for a more substantial meal might try to create something sweet out of nearly nothing. Depression-era cake was the cake that didn't know it was poor. When eggs, milk, and butter became luxuries few could afford, creative bakers found a way to satisfy sweet cravings without these standard ingredients. The result was a remarkably tasty dessert that helped maintain morale during the hardest of times. Known variously as wacky cake, war cake, or simply depression cake, this ingenious creation relied on unusual chemistry to work its magic. The secret? Vinegar and baking soda creating a reaction that made the cake rise without eggs. A typical recipe included flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, salt, vegetable oil, vinegar, and water, all mixed together in the same pan it would be baked in. The cake was so easy to make that even people who couldn't afford cooking school, which was basically everyone, could master it on the first try. This humble dessert became a highlight of birthdays and holidays during the 1930s, when families desperately needed something to celebrate. Many people who grew up during this era would later recreate these cakes for their own children, passing down recipes that had saved birthdays during the darkest economic times. It may have been called depression cake, but it was actually the least depressing thing in most households. It was like having a stand-up comedian made of chocolate in your kitchen. The cake's popularity spread through community cookbooks and word of mouth, with neighbors sharing the recipe as a form of emotional support. While lacking the richness of butter and eggs, the cake had a surprisingly moist texture and deep flavor. The biggest miracle wasn't that it tasted good without dairy, it was that families found anything to be happy about while eating dinner by candlelight because they couldn't pay the electric bill. Sometimes even cake ingredients became scarce, forcing communities to get creative by pooling resources for a communal meal. Stone soup might sound like just a children's story about sharing, but during the Great Depression, it became a real survival strategy in many communities. The old folk tale came to life as families pooled their meager resources to create meals nobody could manage alone. The concept was brilliantly simple. One family would start with a pot of water and, yes, sometimes an actual stone for both tradition and a bit of mineral flavor. Then neighbors would contribute whatever tiny bits of food they could spare. A couple of potato peels, a handful of dried beans, a single carrot, or a few wilted celery leaves. By 1932, an estimated 20% of Americans were participating in some form of food sharing or community meals. What began as a desperate measure evolved into regular neighborhood gatherings that provided both nutrition and emotional support. The stone was mostly symbolic, a reminder that something could come from nothing if people worked together. Though some swore the stone added flavor, which proves hunger is the world's most powerful seasoning. These communal soups rarely tasted the same twice. Monday's version might feature more carrots, while Thursday's had extra potato peels. The nutrition content of stone soup could best be described as better than yesterday and not as good as before the crash. When families wanted something more filling than soup, they turned to another creative way to stretch limited ingredients into a complete meal. Noodle casseroles became a way to stretch scraps into meals that could feed entire families during the Great Depression. Unlike today's version loaded with cheese and meat, these were mostly noodles with a hint of flavor, whatever could be scraped together from nearly empty pantry shelves. The basic recipe was simple. Boiled noodles mixed with a small amount of canned soup or leftover broth, perhaps a spoonful of precious meat if available, and maybe some wilted vegetables. These casseroles were so thin, you needed a magnifying glass to find the good parts. Looking for meat in a Depression-era casserole was like searching for honesty in politics. You might find a tiny bit, but not enough to satisfy anyone. The beauty of these dishes was their adaptability. Anything could go in, and somehow it always came out edible. Families would bring these humble casseroles to church gatherings where multiple households could share what little they had. When even noodles became too expensive, some families would turn to an even simpler combination of rice and dried fruit. Sugar was rare, raisins weren't, so they made dinner together. Rice and raisins became an unlikely meal during the Great Depression when families needed to make food stretch beyond what seemed possible. Rice was one of the cheapest starches available, costing just 5 cents a pound in most areas. Raisins, while not as cheap as rice, were more affordable than fresh fruit and had the advantage of not spoiling quickly. Together, they created a meal that was filling and provided some nutrition when little else was available. The preparation couldn't be simpler. Boil rice until soft, then mix in a handful of raisins and maybe a sprinkle of cinnamon or sugar if such luxuries could be afforded. The result was something between a dessert and a main course, confusing the stomach but filling it nonetheless. When even this simple combination seemed too fancy, many households turned to something even more basic, when all you had was onions and time. Onion soup emerged as a survival meal during the Great Depression, turning what was normally a side ingredient into the star of the dinner table. Onions were among the cheapest vegetables available, costing just 2 cents per pound. When there was nothing else to cook, families would slice several onions and throw them into a pot of water with salt. The soup would simmer for hours, then be served over stale bread, allowing the liquid to soften the hardened slices. The bread and onion soup wasn't just for texture, it was there to turn 6 spoonfuls of soup into 20 bites of dinner. What many Americans didn't realize was that their desperate creation had roots in French peasant cooking. When even onions became too expensive, many families resorted to something even more basic: bread, lard, the end. This was the ultimate Depression-era food when nothing else remained in the pantry. The lard sandwich represented rock bottom for many families, the meal you ate when you had exhausted all other options. During the Great Depression, lard, rendered pig fat, was considerably cheaper than butter and became a staple in most kitchens. A pound of lard cost about 12 cents and could stretch for many meals. Families would spread it thinly on bread as a substitute for more expensive spreads. The texture was slick, the flavor was subtle, and the desperation was obvious in every bite. Sometimes sugar would be sprinkled on top to create a dessert version. Others might add a pinch of salt or cinnamon if they had it. Desperate attempts to make this bare-bones meal taste like something worth eating. Together with water, they created a dining experience that wouldn't earn any Michelin stars, but did earn another day of survival. These 15 humble meals remind us of both the hardship and ingenuity that defined an era.